Old buildings are sometimes demolished to make way for new buildings. Usually these demolitions go according to plan, but not all are successful. Sometimes stubborn buildings refuse to come down or fall in the wrong direction, leading to chaos. Join me for today's video as we take a look at 15 demolitions gone wrong. Number 15. Pontiac Silverdome. Detroit's Pontiac Silverdome has an amazing local history behind it, having once played host to the Pope, a World Cup, and a Super Bowl. But all good things must come to an end, and while the Pontiac Silverdome's Detroit Lions spent years bringing down the house to 80,000 roaring fans, the house quite literally came down in 2017, when the venue was scheduled for demolition. At least that was the initial goal. The demolition began with a partial implosion that was supposed to take down the structure's upper section as the first stage of a year-long demolition project. The upper concourse was lined with explosives, but instead of going out with a bang, the entire event ended with a whimper. The explosives went off, but aside from a few puffs of smoke, not much else happened. According to the company tasked with the demolition, 10% of the explosives failed to go off, which is why the upper section of the Silverdome failed to go down. And the next best hope was for gravity to take over. And when one of these sections would fall, it should have ripped down the rest with them. The real question was, when? What should have been a spectacular scene and the most explosive action the Pontiac Silverdome had ever seen ended up being one expensive letdown instead. Number 14. Red Road Flats. The Red Road Flats in Glasgow were local icons for a multitude of reasons, one of which being they were the tallest residential buildings in Europe when they were built as social housing in 1960. But all good things must come to an end, and so the Red Road Flats were scheduled for demolition in 2015. However, things didn't go quite according to plan. Explosives went off at the base of the building, causing them to come crashing down to the ground. But when the dust finally settled, onlookers were bewildered to see some of the towers were still standing. So what the hell happened? How were 60-year-old buildings able to withstand a blast like that? Well, it turns out that these Red Road Flats were built with steel and were far too tough to be brought down by such a blast. Contractors had identified discrepancies between the construction records and the size of the steel being used, so the correct amount of explosives wasn't used to bring the flats down. Most buildings in the area have been built with concrete, and so the failed demolition of the Red Road Flats can simply be chalked up to a bout of human error. But in the end, the demolition crews called for the use of high-reach machinery to bring the remaining two towers down. Number 13. Danish Silo. When demolition is underway, no one expects things to go awry. Teams get together to make sure the structure comes down quickly and efficiently without harming the surrounding area. But that's not quite what happened in the Danish town of Vordenborg in April of 2018. Onlookers came from far and wide to watch the silo be demolished. They cheered at the sight and sounds of the explosions, but what happened next had them running for cover. Despite all the planning, the silo fell the wrong way during the demolition, toppling toward the waterfront library and musical school. Luckily, both of these buildings had been cleared in preparation for the event and no one was hurt, and neither structure suffered from much interior damage. The only real victim here was the library books, which were said to be covered in dust, perhaps a little too much even for the books' dust jackets. The local government immediately called upon the fire department, who toiled all through the night to help secure the cultural center, and an investigation was quickly underway to see what just caused this operation to go terribly wrong. Number 12. Zip Feed Mill Tower. Alright, this next demolition gone wrong happened on December 3, 2005 in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with the victim being the Zip Feed Mill Tower. Once the tallest building in South Dakota, the Zip Feed Mill Tower had stood empty for years and finally outlived its usefulness outside of hosting flocks of pigeons and little critters. Some saw the structure as a reminder of the area's agricultural past, while others saw it as an unnecessary eyesore. But either way, it was out with the old and in with the new. The columns of the 202-foot-tall tower were all lined with explosives before the exterior walls were ripped down, and the explosion of the white concrete block should have been a fun spectacle for the locals. Too bad it didn't quite go according to plan. Onlookers were left disappointed when, despite the big boom, the Zip Feed Mill Tower stood relatively strong. The concrete tower plopped right down onto its basement, leading over to one side. The demolition crews had attempted to drop the building by cutting the reinforced bars throughout the structure, then placing charges in a ring around the base and up between the vertical silos. But the crew had seriously underestimated the amount of cutting and explosives required to break down the tower's vertical integrity. In the end, it took 2 weeks of work from a crane and a wrecking ball to complete the demolition. And the former tallest building in Sioux Falls was replaced by the 11-story Century Link Tower. It will forever stand as a testament to the saying, "They just don't make them like they used to." Number 11. Bridge in Little Rock. London Bridge is falling down, but how about this 100-year-old bridge in Little Rock, Arkansas? Well, the short answer is no. The old bridge was set for demolition in October of 2016, strapped with dozens of explosives and set to drop into the water below for cleanup crews to take care of. According to the crew's initial report, the entire endeavor should have taken less than a minute in a true blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment. But the century-old bridge just refused to go down because, to the dismay of onlookers, the bridge was still standing strong once the smoke cleared. So what should have just taken a moment turned into a 5-hour endeavor as Arkansas Highway and Transportation Department crews worked tirelessly to bring it down, despite the bridge having been deemed structurally deficient. The bridge had certainly been through a lot, having survived the Great Depression, World War II, and even the Arkansas 1927 flood. So what exactly happened with this one? Well, it's an interesting thing because upon further investigation, everything did go according to plan. The explosives went off and created the proper cuts, but the bridge still stood simply because it had fallen onto itself. From there, crews rigged cables to the structure from a tugboat. Following an inspection of the bridge after the failed explosion, the AHTD said everything but the outcome went as planned, noting that the charges made all the cuts they were supposed to. Officials said the bridge remained standing because it fell onto itself, and so it took some steel cables attached to tugboats and a few hours to finally bring it down. Number 10. Clarion Hotel. The Clarion Hotel in Las Vegas had existed several iterations since 1970, and its odd history seems to be the precursor for its demolition. It was a stubborn building that refused to go away even down to the final moments, and in 2015 it was set for demolition. Everything was set for the 3 a.m. implosion. The explosives went off according to plan, but to everyone's dismay, not much happened afterward. The Clarion Hotel was still standing pretty strong. The hotel should have dropped straight down after the owner hit the ceremonial plunger to initiate the explosion. But the strongest component of the hotel, the elevator shaft, just wouldn't go down, choking the building in place. The piece dropped ever so slightly and even started to tilt west as the rest of the structure fell straight down in a giant plume of dirt and dust. Las Vegas is no stranger to structural demolitions, but the Clarion Hotel is the first to leave a portion standing. But it still had to come down, and so a crane was sent back to the site to knock the tower down by the end of the day. Number 9. Turkish Flower Building. This building had been standing in Turkey since 1928, but about 80 years later in 2009, it was time for it to come down. The building had been derelict for years and was scheduled for demolition. Everything seemed like it was going according to plan until the building didn't quite come down the way the crews had hoped. Instead of coming straight down, the building toppled onto its side and rolled over onto its roof. And to add insult to injury, it happened breathtakingly close to occupied flats, with dozens of residents watching from their windows, hoping they would stay safe. Luckily though, despite all the dust, debris, and threat of being crushed by this old flower factory, there were no casualties whatsoever. So in the end, the building was still standing, albeit upside down. It's definitely one of the scariest entries on this list, and despite how it literally went down, it still had a happy ending. Number 8. Leaning Tower of Dallas. The famous tower in Pisa isn't the only leaning tower in the world. There was also the Leaning Tower of Dallas. This Dallas high-rise earned its nickname after an attempted demolition that went a bit wrong. The 11-story tower was set to be demolished in 2020, and spectators came to watch the excitement from the sidelines. The explosives went off and the walls came crashing down, but when the dust cleared, everyone's jaws were on the floor. Part of the 11-story building was still standing. The center structure and the elevator shaft held strong, despite the demolition team's best efforts. The Leaning Tower of Dallas refused to fall, so construction crews were forced to bring in their long-reach excavator to finish the job. But it still wouldn't go down, and even people started to root for the Leaning Tower. In the end, though, it took some cranes and a wrecking ball to tear it all down. But before the story concluded, 200 people signed a petition to turn the Leaning Tower of Dallas into a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Note to contractors everywhere, get her done right the first time. Number 7. Australian Beer Silo. In May 2013, an old beer silo in Brisbane, Australia was just about ready to come down. It was about 50 years old, and demolition crews set about 100 kilograms of explosives around the base to bring it straight down to the ground. But the old silo had other plans. The crowd of onlookers was left pretty disappointed once the dust had settled. because while the explosives went off, they didn't do much. Instead of crumbling straight down, the base went out from underneath and the old silo seemingly just plopped down onto its bottom. Experts went on to say that there's always a chance that the demolition won't quite work and the structure can still hold up the way this one did, and the line between too much and not enough explosives is a very fine one. So chalk this one up to a good mix of chance and human error. But just because the old beer silo was stubborn didn't mean the demolition crews were ready to give up. They quickly came in with backhoes to give the silo that extra nudge it needed to send the 4,000-ton structure to the ground. Number 6. Liverpool Flats. In April of 2016, the Churchill Flats in Liverpool were set to come down in the early afternoon, but the tower block had some other plans. This was a fun one because instead of one demolition gone wrong, this one saw two. Hundreds of residents gathered around to count down to the moment when the 6 tower blocks were set to come down. But much to their dismay, only 4 came down with 2 left standing. The second attempt to bring them down was made to no avail. The explosives all went off, but the towers just wouldn't budge. The third time was a charm, but even so, this third attempt only managed to bring down a quarter of the tower. Onlookers were probably laughing at this point, while the demolition crews may have had their heads in their hands. Finally, the crews secured some steel cables around the bottom of the building and managed to dislodge a corner of the building, sending rubble flying down to the ground. But the worst part here was that the neighbors all needed to evacuate their homes beforehand, and so they were all forced to wait for far longer than anticipated, and dozens of local families ended up spending the night in a hotel. So many of these older buildings were built with strong steel beams, which is why they so often just refuse to come down and be left in a heap of rubble. Number 5. Anglesea Power Plant. Bringing down an old power plant is no easy feat. Sure, you gotta bring the structure down itself safely, but you also need to make sure that the old debris and residue don't make it out into the air to be dispersed and inhaled into local lungs. In 2018, demolition crews had their work cut out for them when they needed to demolish the Anglesea power plant in Australia. Plenty of people came by to watch from a safe distance, some of whom waited for more than 3 hours to get in on the action from the best possible vantage point. The demolition was scheduled for noon, and yet by 2 p.m. the power plant still stood. Eventually, a spark exploded from inside the building as 2 steel structures on either side of the old power plant crumbled to the ground in a clamor of thunder. But most of the 6-story building was still standing. But to make matters worse, many locals had banded together to voice their concerns over the potential exposure to asbestos after seeing how much smoke and debris made its way into the airstreams. The company behind the power plant and its demolition have gone on the record as saying everything was fine, but others will argue that they never fully complied with the necessary measures required of them prior to making this demolition gone wrong a double fail. Number 4. Avondale Mills Smokestack. When this smokestack in Pell City, Alabama was set to be demolished, no one could have ever prepared for the mayhem that would ensue. Prior to what we see here, there had already been 2 failed attempts to bring down the Avondale Mills smokestack, both times with dynamite. The stubborn smokestack just wasn't ready to come down, I suppose, so contractor Tim Pfeiffer got into his excavator to dig around the base of the structure to bring this 113-year-old smokestack down once and for all. And down it came, only it came down right on top of Pfeiffer's excavator, with rock, dirt, and dust completely crashing down on the vehicle. But someone up there must still like Pfeiffer, because he walked away from the incident, albeit not unscathed. The incident also caught the Alabama District Attorney's attention, and upon further investigation, they found that the contractor had provided an expired permit to conduct the demolition. Turns out the use of dynamite was illegal, and so to add insult to injury, Pfeiffer found himself behind bars for the faulty permit and possession of explosive devices, a Class B felony with a penalty of up to 20 years. Officials had also fenced off the smokestack's remains after the incident to look for any unexploded dynamite before coming up empty. It's an incredibly scary situation that, while it could have been worse, still had a bad ending for Mr. Pfeiffer. Number 3. Crawford Station Demolition. The Crawford Station was a coal-fired power plant built back in 1924 in South Lawndale in Chicago, Illinois. And after operating for nearly a century, the factory closed its doors in 2012 after a long battle with the community over pollution. Crawford Generating Station was one of the last standing coal-fired generating facilities in a major U.S. city by the time it retired, and demolition had finally been scheduled for 2019. The event seemed to be doomed from the beginning. On December 30th, 2019, a worker fell to his death, halting the demolition while his wife filed a lawsuit against the site's developers. Demolition resumed in January of the next year, and on April 11th, 2020, the concrete smokestack was imploded. Now, unlike many other structures on this list, this smokestack came straight down like it was supposed to, only it completely blanketed the surrounding little village neighborhood with toxic dust. The mayor executed a stop work order and a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the residents. News footage permeated the airwaves depicting the locals walking around town wading through the thick toxic dust that lay down all around them. The entire situation was an absolute mess and makes you wonder why there wasn't a better thought process going into this demolition. Number 2. Ohio Mad River Power Plant. The planned demolition of the Mad River Power Plant's massive 175-foot smokestack in Ohio went absolutely wrong on a November day in 2010. The explosives went off, but the smokestack decided to fall the wrong direction. Thankfully, no one was injured, but this controlled blast should have sent the tower tumbling onto a cleared area towards the east, but instead it came crashing down towards the southeast, falling onto 12,000-volt power lines and backup generators. Whoops! And to make matters worse, a group of about 25 people made up of the media, the employees of the energy corporation, demolition crews, and their family members stood nearby before quickly scattering from what could have been an electrifyingly deadly scene. And when there's smoke, there is fire, or in this case, when there's a crushed power line and generator, there's a massive power outage. About 4,000 customers on the west side of Springfield lost power for more than 2 hours, and drivers were treated to a bit of mayhem when nearby traffic lights suddenly stopped working. How could something like this happen? Well, the demolition crews were anything but careless, having correctly set and detonated the explosives, but a small crack went undetected on the smokestack's south side, which caused it to fall straight back. And while it certainly was an explosive situation, it could have been much worse, seeing as how the only thing hurt was property and everyone nearby managed to walk away from the scene unscathed. Number 1. St. Petersburg Sports and Concert Complex. Easily the worst demolition gone wrong is the demolition of the St. Petersburg Sports and Concert Complex. Having first opened its doors to spectators in 1980, the arena hosted big-name entertainers like Billy Joel, the Scorpions, Metallica, and Lady Gaga. But it finally closed its doors in 2019 and was set for demolition in 2020. What ensued was an absolutely appalling disaster. A demolition worker was still inside when the roof collapsed prematurely, killing him. In the footage, you can see the man with a blowtorch cutting through the metal supports just before the massive structure disintegrates. He had been trying to make it to the safety of the cage suspended from a crane, but sadly, he couldn't make it in time. It's one of the saddest demolitions in recent history, with the young man being just 29 years old. He was one of 4 employees hired to cut the metal cables to dismantle the roof of the arena. Rest in peace, my man.
Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.
Thank you to our channel members.